The city of Nanjing, proud and ancient, always moved with a rhythm of its own. Buses hissed at the curbs, bicycles clattered through narrow lanes, and shopkeepers lifted metal shutters at dawn as the air thickened with the scent of fried dough and soy milk. More than 9 million people lived here, a sprawling web of lives stacked in concrete towers and stitched together by rivers, bridges, and highways. But in July of 2025, something changed. It began online with whispers. On travel forums, in private group chats, scattered across social media feeds, the same warning surfaced again and again. Do not go to Nanjing. Some posts framed it as a joke, others as a threat. At first, it seemed like one of those strange internet rumors that would vanish in a few days. But this one didn't fade. It grew. Within weeks, the boycott of Nanjing was everywhere. Hashtags trended. Influencers casually dismissed the city as if it carried an invisible plague. Train tickets to Nanjing sat unsold. Even cab drivers in neighboring provinces spoke of the city as though stepping inside meant taking a risk. Inside Nanjing itself, residents blinked in confusion. They walked their usual routes to work, crowded onto the subway, filled the tea houses, and asked themselves, why are outsiders treating us like we are cursed? For a while, the question hung unanswered. One evening, as dusk painted the Yangtze in shades of rust and silver, a man carried a watermelon down a quiet street. The fruit was enormous, balanced in his arms, sweat sliding down his temples as he struggled toward his uncle's home. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed someone approaching, a stranger with a sharp gaze and a smirk that didn't belong. The stranger paused, tilted his head, and sneered. "Going to see your old man?" The words were meaningless, but the venom in the tone made the air heavy. The man stopped, startled, unsure how to respond. Before he could speak, the stranger walked away, leaving nothing but the echo of disdain behind him. It was such a small encounter, odd, unsettling, quickly over. Yet for the man with the watermelon, and later for countless others who heard the story online, it became a symbol. A sign that something invisible was already twisting through the city's veins. Because the truth was this: the boycott, the suspicion, the unease, they all pointed back to one figure. A man known only by the internet's cruel imagination, Uncle Red. At first, his name carried no weight. It was just another strange handle in the endless sprawl of online personas. But soon it became a curse that could ruin reputations and relationships and topple businesses. Uncle Red's story would prove that sometimes one man's private deception can grow into a public disaster, staining an entire city with fear. What made the story extraordinary wasn't only what he did in the shadows of his apartment. It was what happened after, when the private became public, when humiliation turned viral, and when the lives of more than 1,600 men collided with the merciless humor of the internet. Nanjing, a city that had stood for centuries through wars and dynasties, would suddenly find itself paralyzed not by plague, not by disaster, but by scandal. And all of it began with Uncle Red. But who was he? At this point in our story, most residents of Nanjing had no idea. They only knew the symptoms, the sudden stigma surrounding local men, the collapse of gyms, the jokes that stung like thorns. Outsiders were already calling them untrustworthy, dangerous, even cursed. The boycott was in full force, and yet the root cause remained hidden. In the quiet apartments overlooking crowded streets, in the gyms where memberships were being canceled in waves, In the homes where suspicion had begun to grow between husbands and wives, no one yet understood the scale of the storm about to break. But they would, because buried inside a single man's computer thousands of files slept, waiting to ignite a scandal unlike anything China, or perhaps the world, had ever seen. How could one man, alone in his basement apartment, bring a city of 9 million people to its knees? That is the mystery that would soon grip every household, every newsfeed, and every whispered conversation across Nanjing. The answer begins with the strange double life of Uncle Red. The story of the man with the watermelon did not end with that single encounter. It spread, first among friends, then into neighborhood chatter, and finally into the endless scroll of social media. What seemed like a trivial insult became a riddle the whole city couldn't stop replaying. Why would a stranger stop him just to sneer, to speak words that carried no clear meaning? People whispered that the phrase "going to see your old man" might be code, a mocking label tied to something darker. Others insisted it was connected to the boycott, a hint of the scandal already burning beneath the surface. Whatever the truth, one detail refused to fade: the watermelon. That fruit, ordinary and heavy in the man's arms, would return again and again in the days to come, resurfacing in memes, in jokes, in the cruel nicknames that would haunt the victims of Uncle Red's scheme. But the man with the watermelon was just one among many. Far from the streets, in a cramped basement apartment with peeling paint and dim yellow light, Uncle Red sat at his desk. The disguise lay waiting: a cheap bob-cut wig, a tube of lipstick, a layer of pale foundation that turned his face into a mask. He was not elegant. He did not strive for glamour. His performance relied on something simpler, something strangely effective: softness. When he went live on social media, he spoke with a quiet, almost weary voice. He played the part of a woman sighing about her marriage, a wife starved for affection, a figure trapped in routine and loneliness. His sentences drifted like smoke, confessions of boredom, little complaints about her husband, fragments of longing. The men who watched believed her. They sent messages, sometimes cautiously, sometimes urgently. And soon enough, their words carried the same question. Could they meet? For 3 years, they came. Some brought small gifts tucked under their arms: cooking oil, cartons of milk, fresh fruit bought at the corner market. It was a gesture, a token exchange, the kind of thing you'd bring when visiting a distant relative or an old neighbor. The irony, of course, was that these ordinary gifts would become infamous symbols once the truth came out. Each man entered believing he was stepping into a private story, an encounter hidden from the world, forgotten as soon as it was over. They had no idea the moment they crossed that threshold, a camera in the corner was already watching, capturing everything. Uncle Red's collection grew in silence. File after file, night after night. Thousands of recordings, neatly stacked into folders. By the time he was caught, more than 1,600 men had appeared on those screens, each one unaware they had become part of his secret archive. And yet, for all his deception, Uncle Red wasn't content to keep his trove to himself. Unencrypted group chats, tucked away on platforms where money and shadows mixed, he sold them. Each file passed like contraband, traded for profit. In the anonymous world of digital exchanges, his archive traveled far beyond the 4 walls of that apartment. It was only a matter of time before the secret leaked. When it did, the city shook. Screens lit up with collages, 10 faces, 10 nicknames, chosen not by police or journalists, but by the unforgiving humor of the internet. The top 10 list became an instant phenomenon. Strangers shared it as if it were entertainment, not evidence of betrayal. Number 1 was called Might As Well Guy. Number 7, Watermelon Guy. Number 9, Black Leather Jacket Guy. For the men on that list, anonymity collapsed overnight. Their lives, once private, now belonged to the crowd. And Nanjing itself, its streets, its gyms, its people would begin to carry the weight of that humiliation. But the scandal was not just about faces on a screen. It was about what those faces meant. Each one represented not only a victim, but a question. Were these men deceived, manipulated into something they never agreed to? Or had they walked willingly into a secret they thought they could hide, only to be exposed? The internet could not agree. And in that argument, crueler forces stirred judgment, mockery, and shame that would ripple through every corner of the city. Because this was no longer about Uncle Red alone. It was about every man who might resemble the ones on his list. It was about trust, consent, and identity. And as the scandal grew louder, one thing became clear. The story of Uncle Red was not only a private crime, it was the opening act of a public reckoning. The boycott of Nanjing suddenly made sense to outsiders. They saw the city not as a place of culture and history, but as a stage where humiliation had taken root. Inside the city, though, confusion turned into fear. Men glanced over their shoulders at the gym, at the subway, even at their own friends. Women whispered doubts about their partners, their brothers, their colleagues. Businesses trembled as customers canceled memberships, cut ties, and avoided gatherings. The scandal spread like a fog, thick, suffocating, impossible to escape. And at the center of it all sat Uncle Red, his wig, his lipstick, and his camera. The question lingered, heavier with each passing day. How many lives could one man unravel before the city itself began to break? Uncle Red was not a man who blended easily into the world outside. In the daylight, walking along the crowded boulevards of Nanjing, he seemed ordinary, just another middle-aged resident among millions. Yet behind closed doors, he shaped himself into something else entirely. The transformation was never elaborate. He wasn't chasing beauty. He wasn't chasing glamour. Instead, he crafted a mask just convincing enough to tug at the imagination of lonely men scrolling late at night. The wig, thin and synthetic, clung awkwardly to his head. The lipstick, too red, too uneven, stood out like a wound across his mouth. And the foundation, pale and heavy, coated his skin in a ghostly layer. But when paired with his quiet, measured voice, when framed by the grainy blur of a live stream, it worked. He called himself a wife. A woman trapped in the boredom of marriage, abandoned by affection, speaking softly of nights spent staring at the ceiling. He didn't plead. He didn't seduce. He complained, and he sighed, and he let the silence between words stretch just long enough to feel like longing. That was all it took. Men reached for their phones, typing messages they never thought they would send. At first, curiosity. Then flirtation. Then something bolder. Could they come see her? And so, one by one, they did. They walked narrow staircases that smelled faintly of mildew. They stepped into a basement that felt smaller than it was, dimly lit and sparse. Some carried bags with groceries or fruit, tokens of politeness. A watermelon, a bottle of cooking oil, a carton of milk. They believed these small offerings bought them entry into a private world. But the moment they crossed the threshold, the truth waited in the corner. A camera, discreet, silent, patient. The first recordings might have felt like trophies, proof of a successful trick. But as the weeks turned to months, as the folders on his computer filled and multiplied, the deception grew into an operation. File after file, timestamp after timestamp, each video captured another fragment of someone else's secret. And still, the men kept coming, hundreds, then more than 1,000. None of them imagined they were being transformed into products, into content to be sold to strangers who would never know their names but would never forget their faces. Uncle Red didn't need to advertise. The groups were already there, hidden chats where files were passed like contraband, where men became entertainment, where money flowed in silence. The scandal that would shake Nanjing was already being born. But what kind of man could build such a deception and keep it alive for so long? To some, he was a predator. To others, a trickster, an opportunist. But behind the disguise, Uncle Red was something harder to define, a man who found power not in wealth or violence, but in control. Every file he saved, every face he captured, gave him authority over someone else's future. Perhaps he believed he would never be caught, or perhaps he simply didn't care. What mattered was the archive, the growing evidence of how fragile trust could be, how easily desire could be manipulated, how deeply shame could wound. On the surface, Nanjing was still bustled. Families strolled through parks, students laughed outside tea houses, workers hurried home with groceries dangling from their arms. But beneath that ordinary rhythm, something was shifting. The whispers of a scandal grew louder. Rumors swirled of men being filmed without consent, of videos spreading beyond the shadows, of faces that might soon appear in the open. The city did not yet know how many lives had been touched, how many homes would soon fracture, how many businesses would collapse under suspicion. But it sensed that something enormous was moving just beneath the surface. And when the truth finally broke through, it would not be the scandal alone that shocked the world. It would be the reaction, the merciless, mocking theater of the internet, turning human lives into memes, nicknames, and cruel jokes that spread faster than any official news ever could. Still, before the collapse, before the boycott, before the gyms locked their doors, there was the man at the center of it all. Sitting in his basement, his disguise resting on the table beside him, his computer glowing with the evidence of hundreds of encounters. He adjusted his wig and painted his lips red once more. The mask was simple, but simple was enough. And the men would keep coming. How long could this fragile lie survive before it shattered and took a city with it? Night in Nanjing often felt alive, lanterns glowing above crowded food stalls, the fragrance of grilled skewers drifting through humid air, scooters buzzing down alleyways. Yet while the city stirred with its nightly rhythm, another kind of traffic moved unseen. Men arrived one by one at a basement apartment that looked no different from the rest. They slipped through narrow staircases, carrying bags that clinked with bottles of cooking oil, cartons of milk sweating under the summer heat, or round watermelons tucked awkwardly under their arms. Each gift was a gesture of courtesy, a symbolic exchange. Nothing extravagant, nothing expensive. Just enough to say, I came with something to offer. They believed they were stepping into a hidden romance, a secret encounter meant only for them. What they never saw, what none of them could see, was the small camera perched discreetly in the corner, its lens unblinking. The room itself was unimpressive. A thin mattress pressed against the wall, a desk scattered with makeup and wires, a faint smell of damp concrete. But once the door closed, the stage was set. And always, the camera watched. Uncle Red kept his disguise ready like a soldier keeps armor. The wig rested on a mannequin head, the lipstick worn down to a stub, the pale foundation powdering the air. With these tools, he did not need charm or beauty, only the suggestion of intimacy. The men carried their own imaginations with them, and he simply offered a place for those imaginations to unfold. Every visit ended the same way. A file saved, a number added. The archive expanded, folder by folder, until the weight of it was staggering. By the third year, there were more than 1,600 recordings. Each one carried a date, a face, a moment stolen. What had started as a trick had grown into an empire of humiliation. But Uncle Red did not hoard these files in silence. Behind layers of encryption, across shadowy group chats that thrived on anonymity, the videos began to circulate. Telegram became the marketplace. In digital backrooms, strangers traded links like currency, and Uncle Red's archive became a product line. Each man who had entered the basement believed his secret was locked away. Instead, his image, his body, his vulnerability passed between faceless buyers. And with every transaction, the scandal in waiting grew sharper, heavier, impossible to contain. The city above remained unaware. Gyms still roared with clattering waits. Office workers still filled the subways. Families still laughed over hot pot dinners. But beneath the surface, the cracks were forming. Because eventually, secrets like these do not stay hidden. When the first rumors surfaced online, hints of a collection, whispers of men caught on camera, most dismissed them as internet folklore. The idea was too extreme, too outrageous, but then screenshots appeared. Grainy images of faces half-turned, frozen mid-expression. A handful of files slipped from the shadows into the open, and suddenly the whispers carried weight. The archive was real. And though no one yet knew the full scale, the truth was clear. It was enormous. For Uncle Red, this moment may have felt inevitable. Sitting at his desk, scrolling through the folders on his screen, he must have known the walls of his secret world were beginning to crumble. But still, he carried on another recording, another file saved, another transaction made in silence. Perhaps he thought the digital fog would shield him forever, that the world outside his basement could never touch him. But in July of 2025, the fog lifted. The police came. The archive was seized, and Uncle Red's name, once unknown, was dragged into the open. The arrest should have ended the story there. But in truth, it was only the beginning. Because once the files became public knowledge, the internet did what it always does. It didn't simply expose. It mocked. It twisted. It transformed lives into memes. And that was when the scandal leapt from private crime into national spectacle. The top 10 list was the spark. 10 faces pulled from thousands of recordings, each branded with a cruel nickname. Might as well guy, watermelon guy, black leather jacket guy. The list tore across the internet like wildfire. For the men in those images, there was no hiding anymore. Their secrets, their shame, their privacy all gone in an instant. And for the city of Nanjing, the fallout was about to begin. What happens when an entire community is forced to carry the weight of one man's deception? That question would soon become Nanjing's reality. The police arrest of Uncle Red should have been the climax. Handcuffs clicking shut, a computer tower carried out as evidence, case closed. But the scandal didn't end there. In fact, it had only just begun. Because once the archive became evidence, fragments began leaking into the digital wild. It wasn't law enforcement who released them, it was the internet itself. Screenshots, snippets, whispered claims from people who swore they had seen the files, and then came the list. It arrived like a thunderclap. The top 10 men of Uncle Red. No one knew who created it. Maybe a Telegram user, maybe a troll on Weibo, maybe someone desperate to stir the pot. But within hours, it spread across forums, private chats, and eventually mainstream feeds. 10 blurry screenshots, 10 stolen faces, each labeled with a mocking nickname. Might as well guy, the man whose resigned expression seemed to say, well, I'm already here. Watermelon guy, caught on film cradling his gift like a newborn. Black leather jacket guy, mid pose, trying to look cool, forever frozen in ridicule. Each nickname turned a private humiliation into a public brand. For the internet audience, it was a comedy, a meme goldmine. TikToks reenacting the encounters appeared within days. Parody songs riffed on the nicknames. AI voiceovers mocked the men as if they were cartoon characters. But for the men themselves, it was a nightmare without end. One story cut through the noise, the story of Michelle. Michelle was a young woman, engaged, planning a wedding, her life seemingly stable. Then one evening, her friends sent her the viral list. They laughed nervously, pointing to one of the faces. It was her fiancé. The black leather jacket he wore in the video was unmistakable. The man she loved, the man she trusted, had been part of the scandal. The engagement collapsed within days. Michelle's heartbreak became its own viral tale, shared on gossip forums, dissected by strangers who knew nothing of her pain. To the internet, she was just another character in the unfolding drama. To her, it was the end of a life she thought she knew. And Michelle wasn't alone. Across Nanjing and beyond, ordinary men lived in terror of recognition. Every glance in a gym mirror, every coworker's laugh in the break room, every buzzing notification on their phones carried the threat of exposure. Was their face already online? Would their family see? Would their lives survive the joke? The cruelty of it all was sharpened by the absurdity of the gifts. Watermelons, cooking oil, cartons of milk, mundane offerings that now carried grotesque symbolism. Entire comment threads mocked the bride price of shame, turning groceries into punchlines. The internet didn't just laugh at the men. It laughed at their desperation, their vulnerability, their very humanity. But as the memes exploded outward, something darker happened. The scandal stopped being about individuals and began staining an entire city. Nanjing men, people said online, as if the crime and humiliation belonged not to 1,600 men, but to all who shared the city as name. Hashtags emerged, boycotts were called, and suddenly Nanjing itself was branded as suspect. Gyms emptied, businesses felt the sting, and a shadow of shame settled over the streets. Uncle Red's basement was gone, but its echo filled the entire city. For the rest of China, and even beyond, it was entertainment. But for Nanjing, it was survival. How does a community heal when its men become punchlines and its women inherit the distrust? The answer would prove as painful as the scandal itself. At first, the scandal was digital. Faces and nicknames bouncing across timelines, gossip filling group chats, jokes shared over late-night noodles. But within weeks, the digital bleed seeped into the streets. Nanjing began to feel different. The first warning sign came from the gyms. Fitness clubs that once echoed with the clatter of weights and the thump of treadmills suddenly fell silent. Trainers waited by the doors, checking their phones, waiting for clients who never showed. Membership cancellations stacked like unpaid bills. It wasn't just random attrition, it was fear. Because too many of the men exposed on Uncle Red's viral list had been Jingor's bodybuilders, personal trainers, young professionals obsessed with strength. And now, every muscular man in Nanjing was suspect. Neighbors whispered, colleagues smirked, and strangers on the subway exchanged knowing looks. If a man looked too fit, too sculpted, too polished, someone would ask, was he one of them? In one corner of the gym, a trainer named Chun stood by the mirror, adjusting his gloves, waiting for a client who had texted him the night before. The client never arrived. Instead, Chun scrolled his phone and saw the hashtags. Hashtag boycott, Nanjing men, hashtag gym scandal. He wasn't on the list. He wasn't in any video. But the shame spread like smoke. No one could prove innocence, only suffer suspicion. The boycott spread quickly beyond the gyms. Dating apps saw profiles tagged with lines like, "Not from Nanjing." Cities that once welcomed Nanjing travelers now whispered about them. A rumor began online that entire wedding banquets had been canceled after grooms were accused of being city men. Shops noticed it too. Cafes lost their regulars. Taxi drivers overheard passengers whispering, "Be careful with Nanjing men." It was as if the city itself had been indicted, placed under invisible trial. The strangest part? People who had never set foot in Uncle Red's apartment were punished most of all. The silent majority, the ordinary men who had no connection, now carried the burden of association. Every handshake felt weighted. Every laugh from a coworker carried suspicion. And no matter how clean their lives, the stain remained. Meanwhile, Uncle Red himself sat in custody, silent and smirking. One man's deception had metastasized into a collective humiliation. The gyms were dying, but so was something deeper: trust. And when trust collapses, what fills the void? In Nanjing's case, it was anger. Anger at Uncle Red. Anger at the men who visited him. Anger at the internet that mocked them. And anger at a world where one scandal could dismantle the identity of an entire city. Yet, even as businesses shuttered and friendships cracked under suspicion, the internet kept laughing. New memes, new nicknames, new edits. It was entertainment to outsiders. For Nanjing, it was survival in a storm of ridicule. But beneath this surface mockery lay deeper questions, uncomfortable, unresolved questions about consent, morality, deception, and what it means to be a victim. And those questions were about to ignite debates louder, sharper, and far more polarizing than anyone expected. The city was still reeling when the online discourse turned into a battlefield. At first, it was whispers and speculation. Who were the men? How many? Were the rumors true? But soon, the tone hardened. Comment sections lit up with moral judgments, memes sharpened into weapons, and the Uncle Red case stopped being a story about one man. It became a referendum on morality itself. One side shouted that the men were victims lured, deceived, secretly filmed, their privacy shattered. No one deserves that humiliation, they argued. But another side mocked them as hypocrites, cheaters who had betrayed partners, fiancés, and families. If they weren't guilty of something, why were they there in the first place? And then, the cruelest refrain of all, they got what they deserved. The debate wasn't just about crime, it was about gender, sexuality, and shame. For some, the scandal revealed an ugly truth about homophobia. Straight men had been tricked into intimacy with another man, and the exposure was treated as the ultimate humiliation. But why should that be shameful? Shouldn't the outrage focus on the crime of filming, not the fear of being seen as unmanly? For others, the disguise itself became the focal point. Uncle Red's wig, his pale foundation, the red lipstick smudged across his mouth. To them, it wasn't just deception, it was a betrayal of trust, of identity, of cultural boundaries already fragile in a conservative society. Social media became a carnival of extremes. On one post, a thread dissected the meaning of consent, arguing whether a man can truly consent if he's misled about his partner as gender. Another post twisted the argument, asking if the outrage would be louder if the victims were women. Still another mocked the very notion of male victimhood, dismissing it as comedy instead of trauma. Every angle became a talking point. Every talking point became a fight. And through it all, memes flourished. Someone looped a parody song about Watermelon Guy, layering a bouncing beat under his blurred face. Others stitched together AI parodies of Uncle Red's voice, turning his act into a grotesque comedy skit. Online, tragedy had been packaged into humor, and the more it hurt in real life, the funnier it seemed on screen. But beneath the laughter, a new unease began to grow. What if it had been your brother, your fiancé, your father? Would you laugh then? The questions hung heavy, never answered, drowned out by the endless scroll of comments. In Nanjing, the firestorm burned hottest of all. Families broke apart over suspicion. Friendships dissolved in silence. Some men deleted their accounts entirely, terrified their faces might appear on the next viral list, and still, the internet demanded more. Because in scandals like these, the truth is never enough. People want villains. They want heroes. They want clear lines in the sand. But here, there were none. Just a mess of victims, crimes, lies, and shame spun into entertainment by a society too eager to laugh, too eager to judge. And if the court of public opinion is harsher than any real court, what justice is left for the people trapped in the middle? The noise of memes and mockery was deafening. But underneath that noise pulsed a set of questions no one could quite answer. Questions that clawed at the heart of the scandal. Questions that refused to stay buried. What exactly does it mean to consent? The men who stepped into Uncle Red's apartment agreed to an encounter, yes. But they agreed under a lie believing they were meeting a woman. Does that deception erase their consent? Or does it only twist it? In forums and live streams, the debates grew sharper. One voice shouted, they were deceived. They never agreed to intimacy with a man. That deception is its own violation. Another retorted, but they agreed to the act itself. How different is this from other lies people tell in relationships about wealth, about marriage status, about identity? And then came the heaviest question of all. If the genders had been reversed, if a woman had been tricked by a man, would the outrage sound the same? The more people argued, the more society revealed its fault lines. Conservatives used the scandal to reinforce old prejudices, sneering at the idea of male vulnerability. Progressives pointed out the double standard, that women's victimhood is mourned, while men's is mocked. LGBTQ+ voices were dragged into the storm, their identities twisted into scapegoats for crimes they had nothing to do with. Meanwhile, the silence of the men themselves became deafening. Over 1,600 lives touched by the scandal, yet almost none spoke out. And how could they? For many, to speak was to expose themselves further. To admit they had been there was to invite ridicule, suspicion, even the destruction of their families. So they stayed silent. And in that silence, the internet filled the void with its own narratives, mockery, memes, moral judgments. The very absence of the victims became a canvas for society to paint its biases. But deeper still, another truth loomed: the camera. The true crime was not just the deception. It was the secret filming, the mass distribution, the selling of stolen intimacy across Telegram channels. It was the theft of privacy on a scale so vast it blurred the line between individual and collective shame. And yet, the world seemed more fascinated by the moral puzzle than the crime itself. What does that say about us? That we care more about gossip than justice? That we laugh louder at humiliation than we listen to pain? That when confronted with complexity, we retreat into mockery instead of empathy? The case of Uncle Red was never just about a wig, a camera, and a lie. It was about what happens when deception collides with desire, when technology collides with trust, and when a society must look into the mirror of its own prejudices. And as the debates raged on, one thing became clear. This was not a scandal that would fade. It was a wound, raw and public, destined to scar the culture that birthed it. But how do you rebuild trust when the very foundations of intimacy feel uncertain? That question would haunt Nanjing and beyond as the fallout continued. If Uncle Red's basement was the stage of the crime, the internet became the stage of its afterlife. And in that space, tragedy was reborn as comedy. The top 10 list was only the beginning. Soon, every detail of the scandal was weaponized as a meme. The watermelons, the pink slippers, the cheap cartons of milk. What had once been ordinary tokens of affection were now internet punchlines, forever stripped of their innocence. One clip, remixed 1,000 times, showed a man carrying a watermelon down a hallway. The caption read, "Delivery for Uncle Red." Laughter filled the comments, like stacked by the millions. And strangers across the continent shared the joke, never thinking about the real man behind the blur. On other platforms, AI-generated parodies sprang up overnight. A digital Uncle Red appeared, singing pop songs in his smeared red lipstick. Deep fake voices mocked the men's supposed confessions. Every viral moment made this scandal less about crime and more about spectacle. For the online audience, it was addictive. Scandal, shame, and humor in one endless loop. But for the men at the center of it, it was suffocating. Imagine scrolling your phone, stumbling across your own blurred face captioned with a joke that would outlive you. Imagine your colleagues laughing at a parody song, not realizing it was mocking you. Imagine being trapped in an internet joke that never dies. The cruelty wasn't always intentional. Sometimes it was just the speed of the internet. The reflex to laugh, to share, to keep the joke alive. Humor became a way to distance from the horror. After all, if you laugh at it, maybe it feels less real. But the cost of that humor was staggering. Digital culture has always thrived on irony, but here, irony blurred into dehumanization. The men became caricatures: watermelon guy, black leather jacket guy, might as well guy. Their individuality erased, their trauma commodified. They weren't people anymore. They were characters in an ongoing show. And the show didn't stop. Weeks after the arrest, new memes still surfaced daily. Month after month, The jokes evolved, mutating with every trend. Even when the scandal faded from the headlines, the memes endured, ready to resurface at the slightest trigger. For Nanjing residents, it was unbearable. People outside the city laughed. Inside, they lived with the shame. Some gyms banned cameras outright, fearing new rumors. Schools lectured students about responsible internet use, while parents whispered at night about moving away. It wasn't just Uncle Red's victims who were mocked, it was everyone associated with them. The internet had turned a city of 9 million into a running punchline. And somewhere, in a cell, Uncle Red's smirk lingered. Because even though the world mocked him too, in a way, he had won. His crime had achieved what he perhaps always desired: attention, chaos, infamy. But what happens when a joke grows so large it begins to reshape society itself? That was the question no meme could answer. The laughter online might have felt harmless to those far away, but inside Nanjing, the weight of the scandal became heavy enough to bend daily life. Shops that once thrived saw empty aisles. Cafes lost their regulars. Taxi drivers reported quieter streets, fewer tourists, fewer passengers at the airport. Even the smallest corner stalls felt it, their owners whispering that outsiders no longer trusted their city. At first, it was gyms that collapsed. Their connection to the scandal was too direct, too visible. But then came ripple after ripple. Trainers who had built reputations over years found their schedules barren. Landlords who had rented apartments near popular fitness districts saw vacancies pile up. Entire chains of gyms, once bright with neon lights and mirrors, went dark one by one. It wasn't just economics, it was identity. Nanjing men became suspect by default. Online jokes translated into offline caution. Women in other cities warned each other in private groups. Don't date men from Nanjing. Travel agencies reported unusual drops in bookings connected to the city. Even universities, once proud of attracting talent, began to hear the whispers. Why study there? Why risk the shame? The city's very name carried an invisible stain. And for the residents themselves, trust became a fragile thing. Families looked at their sons and brothers with unease. Colleagues avoided certain conversations at work. Weddings were postponed. Relationships ended in silence. A city of millions lived with an accusation that touched everyone yet belonged to no one. The cruelty was not just in the jokes, but in the slow unraveling of social fabric. Authorities attempted to restore confidence. Public statements stressed that the crimes were isolated, that the law was handling the case. But the internet was faster than officials, faster than truth, faster than reason. Once a meme defines a city, no press release can erase it. And so the weight lingered, pressing down on every life, every conversation, every street corner, where someone wondered whether a passerby was laughing at them. The economic aftershocks were real. The social wounds were deeper. But the hardest to heal was the quiet sense of betrayal that one man, a wig, and a hidden camera could unravel a city's pride. It left everyone asking, if reputation can fall this quickly, what other truths might be waiting to collapse? The scandal was never just about Uncle Red. By now, everyone could see that. It had become a mirror, one that reflected back not just Nanjing, but the entire society watching. And what the mirror showed was unsettling. The first reflection was of prejudice. At the core of the scandal lay a fear of intimacy between men, fear of being labeled, fear of humiliation rooted in old, unspoken homophobia. For many, the real shame wasn't the filming, or the deception, but simply being exposed in a situation that challenged their identity. That prejudice shaped the cruelty of the memes and the laughter of strangers. It wasn't just mockery, it was a release valve for cultural anxieties that no one wanted to admit existed. The second reflection was of double standards. If the victims had been women, the outrage would have been deafening. There would have been rallies, campaigns, calls for protection. But because the victims were men, their suffering became a punchline. Their silence was misread as guilt. Their pain was diminished by stereotypes of masculinity. Society revealed how poorly it understood the idea of male victimhood, how quick it was to laugh where it should have listened. The third reflection was of internet culture itself, its hunger, its speed, its appetite for turning anything, no matter how tragic, into entertainment. Here was a crime that devastated lives, but online it lived as parody songs, nicknames, inside jokes. Humor gave people distance from discomfort. But in that distance, the victims disappeared entirely. The internet didn't just trivialize the crime, it consumed it, spat it out, and moved on, leaving scars behind. And finally, there was the reflection of fragility. A single man, a disguise, and a hard drive had managed to shake an entire city of 9 million. Trust collapsed. Businesses folded. Reputations vanished. The world saw just how fragile identity, intimacy, and community could be in the digital age. One scandal was enough to unmake the pride of a city, and the shame lingered like a shadow that refused to lift. The scandal revealed not only Uncle Red's deception, but also the deeper truth society wished it could ignore. That prejudice still lingers, that victimhood is not treated equally, that the internet feeds on cruelty, and that the lives we build are more fragile than we want to believe. And as these truths settled, a new question began to form in the minds of many. If one man could expose so much weakness, what might the next scandal reveal? When Uncle Red was finally placed before the law, many expected resolution. Courtrooms, after all, are meant to provide closure, to assign guilt, to deliver punishment, to seal wounds. But here, the trial did not silence the questions. It only amplified them. The charges themselves were straightforward: illegal filming, distribution of intimate material without consent, profiting from private recordings. On paper, the crimes were clear. The scale over 1,600 victims was staggering. The verdict was never in doubt. Uncle Red would face a long sentence. Yet as the gavel fell, the larger questions remained unanswered. What does consent mean when deception is involved? The law could punish the hidden camera, but could it address the lies that led those men to his door? If they agreed under false pretenses, was that consent at all? And if deception invalidated consent, where would the line be drawn? What about lies of wealth, of status, of marriage, of identity? How does the law measure betrayal? Another question hung even heavier. What protection do male victims deserve? For centuries, the narrative of protection and justice was shaped around women and children. When men became victims, society hesitated. Were they truly vulnerable? Or did their masculinity disqualify them from sympathy? The courtroom could not answer cultural bias. It could only issue sentences. And then came the digital dilemma. Uncle Red had sold his archive through encrypted platforms, Telegram groups hidden in plain sight. Once released, those videos multiplied endlessly, impossible to erase. Even as the state tightened laws on digital privacy, the reality remained. Once a secret escapes into the internet, it cannot be pulled back. The justice system could punish Uncle Red, but it could not delete his crime from the servers, the group chats, the memes. Justice was partial, temporary, incomplete. For the victims, that incompleteness cut deepest of all. Their anonymity had been stolen forever. Their silence became survival. Their futures, marriages, and families would always carry the risk of exposure. The law could not restore what they had lost. And so the questions lingered. Was Uncle Red's sentence truly justice, or just the beginning of a larger reckoning with privacy in the digital age? Should society redefine the meaning of consent in a world where identity itself can be disguised? And how can victims ever be protected when the court of public opinion is louder than any judge? The case ended in legal terms, but not in moral ones. And in that gap between verdict and understanding, society found itself staring into a void that law could not fill. Even after the verdict was read and Uncle Red disappeared into the prison system, the city did not breathe freely again. The scandal had already planted roots too deep, and its shadow stretched across Nanjing long after the headlines faded. Businesses struggled to recover. Gyms tried rebranding, repainting their walls, even renaming themselves to shed the stain of association, but the stigma lingered. Some never reopened at all. Trainers left the industry, abandoning years of work, forced into new careers under new identities. The economic wound was not fatal, but it left scars across entire neighborhoods. Social trust remained fractured. For months, couples eyed each other with quiet suspicion. Conversations about marriage included whispered jokes, half humor, half warning about making sure no one was hiding something. Families carried unease into dinner tables. It was not just a scandal anymore. It was a cultural trauma that seeped into daily routines, and the internet never forgot. Every few weeks, memes resurfaced, reborn with new trends. A viral dance used audio spliced from Uncle Red's live streams. A cooking skit mocked the offerings of watermelon and milk. For those far away, it was still comedy. For Nanjing, it was the reopening of a wound. The jokes had no expiration date. They lived forever online. The scandal also shaped conversations far beyond the city. Across China and even across Asia, it became shorthand for deception, for internet cruelty, for the fragility of male pride. Universities cited it in debates on digital ethics. Media outlets dissected it as an example of how humor and humiliation intertwine in modern culture. Even lawmakers invoked it while pushing new privacy protections, pointing to Nanjing as a case study in how one man's crime could ripple through millions of lives. But perhaps the deepest impact was invisible, a shift in how people trusted each other. Many began to second-guess intimacy. Encounters once fueled by curiosity now carried suspicion. New relationships bloomed more slowly, hesitating under the shadow of what had been revealed. Trust, already fragile in a digital world, became a rarer currency. Uncle Red was gone, locked away, but his presence lingered everywhere. In the empty gyms, in the strained silences between couples, in the jokes that refused to die, in the policies rushed into place, in the minds of those who wondered how safe any private moment truly was. The scandal had ended in the courts, but not in life. For Nanjing, and for everyone watching, the shadow remained. When the dust finally settled, the case of Uncle Red stood not only as a criminal story, but as a parable of the times. One man, armed with little more than disguise, deception, and a camera, had managed to shatter lives, cripple industries, and stain the reputation of an entire city of 9 million. Yet beyond the crime itself, it was the reaction, the laughter, the memes, the judgment that revealed the most unsettling truths. The scandal showed just how fragile trust can be. Intimacy, once thought to be private, could be stolen in a heartbeat and multiplied into eternity. A simple lie could unravel identities, relationships, and even economies. It proved that in the digital age, privacy is not a guarantee, but an illusion. It also forced society to confront its double standards. The pain of male victims was trivialized, dismissed, mocked into memes. Their suffering was not met with compassion, but with ridicule. And in that ridicule, society revealed how unequally it values different forms of victimhood. The scandal further highlighted the power and the cruelty of internet culture. Humor can be a shield, but it can also be a knife. By turning a tragedy into entertainment, the internet stripped the victims of dignity and left scars that will never fade. It showed how quickly collective empathy can vanish in the endless scroll of jokes. But perhaps most of all, the case was a mirror. It reflected fears about gender, shame, and sexuality. It exposed biases buried deep within culture. It revealed the fragility of social trust, the dangers of unchecked digital platforms, and the brutal speed with which the internet can redefine reputations. In the end, Uncle Red's story is not just about him. It is about us. About how we respond to scandal, how we treat victims, how we balance justice with judgment, and how we laugh in the face of pain that is not our own. It leaves a question lingering in the air, a question with no easy answer. In a world where every moment can be recorded, where lies can masquerade as truth, where memes outlive memories, how safe is any of our lives from being turned upside down? And perhaps the most chilling thought of all, if one man could do this to a city of millions, what might the next scandal reveal about the world we've built?